As those of us in the security industry know, perhaps a little too well, breaches do happen. And not to spoil the punchline, but I think by the end of this session, the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, will once again win the day. I'm Doug Aamoth. I'm a marketing director here at Sophos. And joining me today are Dr. Jason Nurse. He's an associate professor in cybersecurity at the University of Kent and visiting academic in cybersecurity at the University of Oxford. And Sarah Eberle, senior director of global public relations here at Sophos. Thank you both for joining me. We've got a lot to cover today, preparing for a possible breach, deciding how to react publicly during the initial stages of a breach, framing messaging, disclosure tactics, and some takeaways based on Dr. Nurse's research and Sarah's decades-long career as a PR pro and journalist. Just some final housekeeping before we get started. What you're about to hear shouldn't be considered legal advice, but merely guidance for how to approach your own planning and developing protocols. So please do check with your own legal team as well when planning your breach communications. So Jason, let's start with you. What inspired you to initiate this research project? And tell us a little bit about the framework and how it's evolved during the course of your research.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Doug. I think what kind of inspired the work was really trying to understand and seeing the fact that there's been so many of course, cybersecurity breaches over the last few years, but especially there are kind of some really big questions around the kind of poor responses that we're seeing to these breaches in terms of organizations not knowing how to respond, who should communicate to the media, what they should actually do immediately after a breach, especially with respect to communications and let's say, public relations, in terms of how do they reach out to customers, how do they notify the media, the public, and so on. So from that, and from not seeing really good, strong, rigorous, robust approaches there, what we decided to do was try to investigate this problem and try to understand, can we build a framework or a playbook or something like that that is actually based on best practice that can identify what should companies actually do, how should companies respond after a data breach. And what we did was develop a framework or a playbook, as we call it. And then we went through evaluating it with interviews with some pretty senior industry professionals, both in from a security perspective and also in terms of crisis response. So that's where the framework more or less came from.
Great. So if we take a closer look at the framework, it looks like it can broadly be split into two areas, pre-event and response. So yeah. When we consider pre-event, Jason, from what you've seen in your research, what are some of the most important things an organization can do before a breach even occurs?
Yeah, that's perfect. And really, it really comes down to pre-breach. It's really about trying to establish what is the organization's aims, what is really, really important and what needs to be dealt with immediately after a breach has occurred, and as soon as the company has recognized that a breach has occurred. And things such as, for example, maintaining crisis response capability in terms of who are the key decision makers, what kind of regulations need to be considered, what legislations need to be considered, and even things like preparing draft responses to release to the media, to release to stakeholders, to release to customers. These are some of the key steps that need to be done before the breach. And then, of course, after the breach, there's a lot of other things that we can pick up on as well.
So Sarah, we work with companies of all shapes and sizes, and for a company that might be small or doesn't have a lot of resources, are there some easy steps that are also effective that they can take when it comes to breach preparedness?
Well, I really appreciate Jason's research, because I can't underscore enough how important it is to have that plan in place and to be prepared. And so from my perspective, as a journalist and as a PR pro, what I'd like to bring to the audience today is what the media is looking for. Like what does a journalist look for when they're covering this type of news? And I can tell you that one thing the audience needs to know about is, are they a public company? Are they a private company? Are they a large company? Are they a household name? Does nobody know who they are? Those are all factors that I would say piggyback on what Jason just set up for you in order to set up that pre-event, during the event, and post-event. Like those are three key factors that you need to be paying attention to when you're considering your response plan and this framework or playbook, as Jason calls it.
So Jason, your research mentions facilitating actual rehearsals to step through a breach response checklist. Do you have any interesting findings from your participants in regards to some of these rehearsals?
Yeah, no, I mean, rehearsals actually came up as a really big thing because from one end, basically interviewees and what individuals thought, what kind of some of the key security professionals and also those in crisis response thought was that what they've seen is that the companies that actually go through these rehearsals, go through trainings, and actually have, let's say, people from the media in to give kind of training to kind of see at the C-suite level. And also kind of other senior managers, that actually made a really, really big difference to how well the company did in cases when there was an actual data breach. So I think that's one key thing, in that rehearsals are really, really important. Getting the media in, getting representatives for the media to train the appropriate people, that's actually extremely important in terms of how well the organization does in the unfortunate case where they actually have a data breach.
Sarah, your thoughts? Do you agree?
I agree. I want to add one point, though, and that is to keep that list of public spokespeople as small as possible. I think, you don't want to confuse the press. Journalists don't want to talk to a lot of different people in these situations. They want to talk to the highest level person, or the person with the most amount of expertise who can address the questions right then and there. And really, since it is a crisis situation for a company, you want to just keep that list whittled down. Your spokesperson really should just be one or two people, if not just one person. Great.
And so we've got our plan in place. Now the day of a breach occurs and we move on to the disclosure phase. Jason, I suppose the first question is to decide whether or not to disclose. And if the answer is yes, what does an organization need to consider with respect to disclosure?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to whether or not to disclose, it comes down a lot to the extent to which who has been impacted by the breach, and also based on the location of these individuals, whether there are certain kind of legislations that needs, because there are certain regulations, because different countries, different jurisdictions will have specific requirements on how organizations should respond if there is a breach in customer data. So that's probably one of the biggest ones that I'd focus on, in terms of being aware of where the customers are, and then also thinking about the jurisdictions and the legal requirements that you have as an organization in how you need to respond. That's probably one of the biggest ones that I'll focus on.
And Sarah, does it make sense to add disclosure scenarios to your pre-event checklist when you're going through your planning?
Absolutely. Especially, again, going back to my first comment, are you a public company? Are you a private company? Are you privately held? There's a lot of different scenarios that contribute to the rules and regulations and the laws that you may need to follow, in addition to what Jason was talking about with what your regional laws might be, or your country laws, or your just your anything geographic. Like, you need to be paying attention to what that requires you to follow. That said, you also want to be thinking about how the customer has been impacted. Like, how have your customers been affected by this situation? And you really want to be thinking about what the press is going to be asking you if you are going out to the press. And they are going to be mostly focused on how this is impacting the consumer. So when you're preparing and rehearsing and you're thinking through your messaging or thinking through these decisions, and they are very difficult decisions, but they need to be made, you want to be thinking through, okay, what is the consumer going to be feeling at this moment in time? How can we communicate best to the consumer? And how can we have empathy for that consumer or that customer that has been impacted in this situation? I would add that to your list of things to be considering when you're developing your messaging and you're deciding whether or not you are going to be going out with this type of news.
And Sarah, are there any obvious scenarios where an organization might not want or need to disclose?
Well, I think that it's really going to be a case by case. And remember that you are in the heat of the moment. This is going to be happening very fast, and you're going to be making decisions that are happening at a split second. And a lot of it could be a judgment call, again, which is why you want to be thinking these things through in advance, so that you do make the best judgment call you possibly can. And when if and when you do decide to go out, you want to make sure that you're going out with as many facts as possible and with as much evidence as possible, because the journalists will be on top of and following your story. And so if they see you go out with a certain number, for instance, and then you want to backtrack on that number or increase it or reduce it or, roll back something you said, that just continues your story and keeps it alive in the press. So you want to be able to go out straight with the facts, build credibility, and have evidence of what you're saying so that you can really come across as a legitimate and serious and credible spokesperson. And then putting your best foot forward for the company. The journalist is really going to be interested in how are you protecting the customer? How does this impact your customer? And what are you doing? And making sure that your facts are straight.
And Jason, in your research, you talk about if deciding not to disclose, there's the potential pitfall of internal whistleblowers. Could you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the kind of key things that kind of arose from the research, because in some situations, when we went through the work, there might be some legitimate situations, as kind of have been mentioned, that emphasize that maybe an organization doesn't need to disclose. And that might be completely legitimate. But one of the really big issues one of the kind of ways that can come back to bite the organization is if there is a whistleblower. And that's just one of the examples. And in case of a whistleblower and the whistleblower basically coming out and the news coming out, the organization was breached and they chose to not notify customers, not notify the media, that can potentially be really, really damaging to an organization's reputation. Because at that point, it looks like the organization knew about the breach and decided to kind of cover it up. And this is one example, but you also have situations such as if the data actually appears on the dark web, and other situations such as that. And those situations can be even more damaging to an organization, because at the end of the day, they'll still have to notify about the breach. And then it looks like they were basically trying to hide it, which is really, really a big challenge, and really it could really harm an organization's reputation, which is why it really comes back to these questions around, should you disclose, or as we did in our research, even in situations maybe where you shouldn't disclose, there might be shouldn't disclose in terms of legislations, for example, or appropriate regulations, you might still decide to disclose because, it's the better thing to do.
Great. So we've had our breach, we've decided to disclose, and now we need to frame the message. So Jason, in your research, you touch on the notion of responsibility. For what you've seen, can you tell us a little bit more about how companies generally accept or perhaps don't fully accept responsibility for a breach?
Yeah, I mean, this was a really kind of contentious topic that we touched upon in our research, because from an academic and also from an industry perspective, what we've seen is that there's kind of almost two sides. And from one side, there's the comment that, well, the organization should or could basically claim to be a victim, just like they're a victim that has been kind of compromised by this malicious attacker or malicious actor. So they're a victim, just like their clients are victims. And then on the other hand, other side of the fence, you basically have the perspective that organizations should accept responsibility, that they are the ones who held the data, and therefore they are responsible for the protection of that data. So if there is a data breach, it's their responsibility. And even though it's a very, very contentious topic and there's kind of arguments from both sides, from our work, we've actually found that accepting responsibility is by far a better way of going about it. Because once again, individuals gave you their data, or people chose to work with your organization. And as a result of that, you have the responsibility to protect that relationship, to protect that data. So actually just saying, unfortunately, we've been breached, it's not our fault, that's really not good enough. And it really comes down to accepting responsibility and just trying to basically put things right from that point onwards.
Sarah, anything to add when it comes to the R word?
Well, Jason is spot on. I mean, really, the journalist is not going to see you as the victim. They're really going to be looking out for the customer, the little guy, the person, the consumer who's been impacted, and what you're doing for them. And so your message really needs to be tailored to the facts, evidence, and how you're taking steps to really help out those who have been impacted. And, it's also possibly a good opportunity to reinforce some messaging. I mean, not in a weird way, but in a way that is helping consumers or customers understand what exactly happened and why. And so, for instance, if there is a data breach and you want to remind customers to reset passwords, for instance, that might be a good opportunity to say that because of heightened credential stuffing on the dark web, you really need to pick a unique password when you reset your password this time. Don't use the password for our account with your bank account or other financial accounts. Use that opportunity to add in some research or just accountability for everybody, so that people are moving forward, you're taking the best steps forward.
Great. And this is a question for both of you. We touched on this a little bit before, I believe. Jason, we'll start with you first. What are the potential downsides of downplaying a breach?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Doug. I think one of the realities there is that often organizations, and I've seen this time and time again in my research, organizations try to approach the fact of the data breach by saying it's not so bad, or it's not that bad, it's not that harmful, in terms of the broader scheme of things, or in terms of how many records have been lost. It's a very small percentage. But I think that's actually a really bad approach, because from what we've found, that kind of almost kind of portrays to those that have been impacted that you're not taking security that seriously. And that's the kind of big thing there. And you never want to get into a scenario where your clients, your customers, your stakeholders have the perception that you're not taking their security, or you're not taking the security of their data seriously. And this also comes around once again when it comes to kind of underestimating breaches and kind of, and I'm sure Sarah will touch on this, but thinking about underestimating a breach when it has happened, and not kind of doing the due diligence and almost checking, what's the scenario here, and instead of just going out to say, oh well, it's only 10,000 records, and then a week later you have to raise up to 100,000 records. I think there's a lot of stuff going on here that needs to be unpacked, but really probably the key message is don't downplay the breach, accept responsibility, and basically show that you're taking security seriously.
Great. So Sarah, your thoughts on that? And is there any scenario in which it might actually make sense to downplay a breach a little bit?
Yeah. Actually, there could be a scenario where you downplay it only because you are correcting facts. And if you need to provide a voice of reason or level set a scenario, for instance, if the press has gotten wind of the story before you've had a chance to go out with any messaging or information, it may have blown up and you might want to reel it back in. And so the one opportunity that you have to level set that could be setting the record straight and not downplaying the situation, but downplaying to provide that voice of reason and actually giving accurate data. That is the only scenario where I could see where you might need to do the quote unquote downplaying.
Okay, so we're neck deep in a breach. We've run through our checklist. We've decided to disclose. We've framed our message, and now we get to execution. So when it comes to getting our message out there, is it better to be quick or thorough, Twitter or email, something else entirely? Jason, let's start with you.
Yeah, I definitely would say that it's better to kind of notify as quickly as possible. This is what we've seen time and time again from engaging with engaging with customers, and also seeing a number of data breach cases. And the key thing is here that what kind of communication as quick as possible does is that it basically increases trust in your organization. It also addresses issues of vulnerability that might be felt by consumers and clients and stakeholders, and that's really, really important. And as kind of Sarah mentioned before, one of the key things here is to ensure that messages such as this come from your organization first, as opposed to from kind of the media generally. From our kind of research, there were about 4 or 5 cases we looked into where in scenarios where customers were actually really, really, really frustrated. It was scenarios where a breach or breach information had been kind of leaked online, or could be found on social media, or was being covered by a news media outlet, and there is no information from the organization to its clients, to its customers about that breach. I think that was one of the key things that came out. And to your point about kind of Twitter or email, or, this is very, very interesting because at the end of the day, it really depends. It depends on who your customers are. It depends on what methods suit them best. And even things, considering things such as age, demographics, locations, all that kind of stuff really, really matters. What we found is that, generally speaking, they're kind of direct and indirect methods of communication. Each of them have their positives and negatives. Direct messaging, direct examples of messaging could be things like email or surface mail. This stuff can sometimes work quite well, and it can be seen as your very personalized messaging for the individuals that have been impacted. On the other hand, you kind of have indirect methods such as kind of, articles in news media or posts generally on social media. And each of these, even though they can have positives, they can have negatives. So for instance, one thing that we saw that was really, really interesting, which we didn't think about at all, was that in some cases, if you're kind of an organization and you're mass mailing, there's some domain name, let's say it's kind of Gmail or Hotmail, one of these other platforms, there might arise scenarios where your emails are actually blocked because it just seems almost like an attack on this separate network. And then also from a kind of a much more indirect side of things in terms of newspaper articles and social media. In social media, what we've seen happen is that if the organization doesn't have the right resources to respond to concerns on platforms such as Twitter and Facebook, things start to descend quite rapidly into kind of complete confusion almost. And this is really a big issue. And these are some of the things that the organization needs to consider when it's trying to decide which method to use to notify, what's going to be most personalized, but also which kind of deals with all the practical challenges that can result from notifying such a large number of individuals about a data breach.
Sarah, anything to add? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I would add that be very careful on social media because of any potential backlash, because it's such a vocal platform. And I like what Jason said about where you need to decide. It goes back to similar to what I was saying, where you want to pick one or two, ideally one main spokesperson. I would also think about one platform where this one message is coming from, that is the source of truth, and you stick with that. Otherwise, you're managing all of these different platforms and voices and replies, and people. It's a heated moment, and people are upset, and so you want to try and contain it as best you can.
Great points. Jason, based on your research, and Sarah, based on your experience, what are some takeaways we can leave with the group here today?
Yeah, I mean, so there's quite a lot, but probably to kind of make it kind of short and sweet almost, I'd definitely say kind of be prepared. And this goes back to kind of thinking about pre-event, in that you can't wait till after the event to try to get these things in place. You really need to think very carefully about pre-event, what needs to be in place, how do you kind of manage that capability to respond in cases of these kind of cyber crises or data breach incidents. The second one I'd probably say very much kind of along the lines of accept responsibility. That came out as a kind of a very big thing for a number of individuals in situations where the company kind of just said, we're victims just like you. It just does not work. So accepting responsibility is really, really key, really, really important. Communicating empathy and really caring about individuals, that's also quite important. I know kind of Sarah will kind of pull on that much more.
Yeah, that's great advice. Number one, remember the journalist is going to be most interested in your customer's perspective, not yours. Number two, be prepared, be prepared, be prepared. And number three, use empathy when you're thinking through your messaging, and be so factual and be accurate. You have one shot to go out and get it right. And you want to get it right at the first time so that your story doesn't peak and peak and peak over and over again. You want to contain that news cycle, because the journalists are going to be looking to poke holes in your story, and you don't want them poking holes in the story. You want it to be contained and from your voice, authentic and credible. And so I would say my last point, building on the being credible, is you want to build credibility with journalists, because if it happens again, which I know, fingers crossed, you don't want it to, but you want to be able to build that credibility with the press, so that you are being presented as an authentic spokesperson and company, so that then if you do need to do this again, you've laid the groundwork as being a credible source.
All right, great conversation. I'd like to thank Dr. Jason Nurse and Sarah Eberly for all their great insights. Jason, and we'll put this up on the screen, but how can people learn more about your research, and are you working on any additional research at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. That's really good question. So yes, there's lots more that can be done, because really at this point in time, we've only kind of scratched the surface in terms of what can companies do and what kind of effective corporate communication after data breach looks like. One thing that we're looking to do to follow up is to try to integrate more technical approaches after data breach in terms of technical incident response approaches to work such as ours, to kind of create, let's say, a bit more comprehensive or holistic framework or approach, so companies know what to do in terms of the technical side of things, but also how does that kind of relate to the more kind of social and the kind of corporate communications and PR response. So that's probably the next thing that we're going to be focusing on, trying to integrate those two as well as possible. To give companies kind of the best guidance as possible. And then kind of in addition to that, in terms of this work, if individuals want to find out more, they can get in touch with me. But also what we're aiming to do is to provide kind of a summary document of the academic paper. If individuals want access to that, it's going to be a 2-pager, and it really tries to kind of delve into the real world, kind of the detailed, the kind of essentials of what organizations need to do, why the framework is important, what it's built on, the rigor behind it, and really give organizations a gentle introduction to the framework itself. So that's probably what I would definitely say individuals to have a look at.
Great. All right. I think that about wraps it up. Everybody stay secure. Thanks for joining us.